Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going to go over my round 5 game from the New York International. Now, if you followed the round 4 video, I was extremely fortunate to get a win in that one because I essentially won on time in a position that was nearly lost. So very, very lucky to win that game, and I really hadn't played a good game yet in the tournament and was hoping to turn that around in this white game. My opponent in this one was another young player, this time born in 2008. Can you imagine that? 2008, by the name of Liran Zhou. And he was around 2,300 FIDE. So, there are these talented 11-year-olds walking around with ratings that are 2,300. It's pretty scary. But that's the new computer world we live in. I was, going to try and press him, even though, he is a good player. I was going to try and press him with the white pieces and try and make something happen. So, anyways, I'm with d4, and Liran went knight f6, and then I went c4, and then he went g6. And the question whenever g6 comes is it going to be a King's Indian or is it going to be a Grunfeld? I actually decided to play knight f3, which is kind of a suggestion that maybe I wasn't too sure which line I was going to play against the Grunfeld. Typically, when I start with knight f3, it's because I'm a little bit unsure and I want to keep the flexibility. Because knight c3 would be the most principled move, you could say. But knight f3 gives me the opportunity to go back into fianchetto lines or more modest lines, not committing the knight to c3. But now bishop g7 was played, and I have that decision again. Do I go knight c3? Maybe he plays the Grunfeld. I don't know. I decided to play knight c3 and just see what happens. And he actually castled, so that told me, okay, he's a King's Indian player, not a Grunfeld player. I'll fight the Grunfeld another day. I went e4 now, and Liran went d6. And after bishop e2, e5, we have this normal King's Indian position. And the question after e5 is which variation do I want to go for? I can castle and invite some of these main lines of the bayonet attack with knight c6 and d5. I can go bishop e3, which invites these Gligorich systems with knight g4 and bishop g5. I can even play d takes e5 and go for the exchange variation. All are viable options, but I actually decided to play d5. And d5 is actually known as the Petrosian variation of the King's Indian and was actually an extremely popular line in the 80s and 90s. Petrosian won a lot of games on the white side of this line, and that's why it has his name. But Kramnik actually used it with great success against Kasparov, and I think that was actually one of the reasons Kasparov decided to ditch the King's Indian in the late 90s, early 2000s, because Kramnik was just beating him like a drum in these lines. Yeah, it has a rich history, but in recent practice, Black has been getting reasonable positions, and the Petrosian is not as feared as it once was 30 years ago. After d5, Black played a5, and that's actually the main move. The idea is that you sort of cement the b4 square right now so that I can't initiate a queenside expansion, and you kind of secure the c5 square potentially for your knight by covering the b4 square. So that's kind of the idea there. I now went bishop e3, and bishop e3 is actually a very provocative move because it kind of invites knight g4. Now, in an ideal world, I would love to go knight d2 and castles, because if I have my bishops on e3 and e2 and my knight on d2, that's actually the ideal King's Indian setup. The reason for it is that once white actually plays c5, the knight on d2 can go to c4 and get quite a satisfactory position. So the point is you go bishop e3, knight d2, and you get this really dream setup. So, for instance, if knight d7 was played, I think that'd actually be a mistake because now I go knight d2, and my pawn is well covered. I can castle. There's no knight h5 stuff because my bishop and queen are both on the square. And, yeah, white is actually totally fine. So because of bishop e3, you're kind of obliged to challenge this bishop with knight g4, and that's actually what Liran did. And then I went bishop g5, and this was kind of my little idea, was to provoke this knight g4, then challenge the queen, and then, if I'm lucky, to go knight d2 and establish that setup again that I was talking about. But after bishop g5, black went f6, kind of disrupting my knight d2 idea. And now I have another choice to make. Do I want to keep it on the diagonal with bishop h4, or do I want to drop it back to d2 or c1? I decided to play bishop d2 because I thought in some lines if I go bishop h4, black will just go g5, and after bishop g3, knight h6, and I thought playing for f5 here is pretty reasonable for black. So I thought bishop d2, kept a little bit of the cards open, and now g5 is not as attractive because, I'd have h4 for starters, just undermining that pawn. So here, black actually went knight a6, trying to get this knight to c5 now. Now that he's sufficiently disrupted my bishop e3, knight d2 plan, he kind of tries to justify the knight being on this square and continues to develop. And now I decide to play castles, but castles is actually not the most principled move. If I'm actually going to challenge this knight on g4, it actually makes a whole lot more sense to play h3 and then actually force the knight to h6. And then from this position, there are plenty of rich ideas, but one of the ideas that's kind of attractive is actually h4. And the point is now to play for h5 because black can actually shut down the file himself. So this move would actually be quite promising, h4, h5, and give white a little bit of an initiative. Yeah. Instead, I castled, and this is just a little bit too modest because it doesn't challenge the knight on g4. And if black seems to be getting a very decent position with all his pieces, so it's not so great. This is the other issue with the move, is actually f5. And this is actually what Liran played. The idea with f5 is instead of putting that knight on h6 after h3, you can actually now put it on, my arrows. You can put it on f6. And on f6, it's just a much better square because it's eyeing e4. It's more centralized. And so now I kind of lost that opportunity to kick the knight away to a suspect square. After f5, I decided to play e takes f5, and my idea here was to play against the hanging pawns that happen after g takes f5. Note that if black played a move like bishop takes f5, that would probably be a mistake because now I have knight g5, and in addition to having firm control over the e4 square, now the bishop is hitting the knight on g4, so that's hanging, and in some lines I have knight e6, just securing the two bishops. So really you need to take with the g-pawn, and my idea here was that now I'd go knight g5, and in some lines go knight e6, but in other lines play against the hanging pawns. Black now went knight f6 back. Makes some sense because I was kind of hitting that knight in certain positions now. And now I played f4. And this was essentially my ideas. In the King's Indian, you can always play against hanging pawns on e5 and f5 by playing f4. And it's a very, positive pawn tension for you because if black doesn't do anything and keeps the tension, a lot of times I can play f takes e5 and open this line for my rook. And if black takes on f4, then after bishop takes f4, the f5 pawn and the h7 pawn are split and kind of weak, and it's hard for this bishop to actually get in the game. So usually after f4 is played, e4 is actually the appropriate response, and that's actually what Liran did here. Makes a lot of sense to keep the position closed. And now the position takes on quite a different character than normal King's Indians because he's not actually getting a direct checkmating attack against my king, and it's more of a maneuvering phase of the game for the next 10 to 15 moves to pretty much determine how to play around this closed position. Now, black does have a nice pawn chain here, but he needs to try and, play around it by playing like knight c5, sometimes king h8 and rook g8 to get played down the g file, and also trying to activate this bishop on d7 because, again, it's shut down by its own pawn on f5 right now. On the flip side, white typically tries to get some queenside expansion or undermine the pawn chain with g4, or sometimes play through the middle through these dark squares with the e3 and d4 squares. So those are kind of the dynamics at play in this position. After e4, I went bishop e3. You can see kind of trying to take advantage of these squares right away. And black actually went knight c5, moving this knight in towards the center. Also, some lines, knight d3 might be an idea if my bishop ever moves from e2. And note here that bishop takes c5 is not super desirable because after d takes c5, this knight can relocate to d6, and it's actually black that has really good control of the center, and the bishop on g7 could potentially be a monster. So playing bishop takes c5 is really ill-advised, and I kind of have to, again, play around the structure. I decided to play knight h3, relocating that knight before it was hit with h6. And in some lines, I really want to try to prepare g4, so I thought knight f2 helps do that, or at least cover the g4 square. After knight h3, bishop d7 was played, and now I went knight f2. Again, eyeing this g4 square, stopping knight g4 ideas for black if they were considered. Also, my knight f2 covers the d3 square, so a pretty decent knight on f2. Black now went queen e8, shifting the queen towards the king side. This makes sense. And I went queen d2, connecting my rooks. Another move that actually was a possibility in this position was actually to play h3. And the idea, again, in some lines is to just entertain the idea of g4 because it's something that black has to constantly think about. If I'm able to get in g4 and then g5 and expand on the king side, it's usually very good for white. So anyways, after queen e8, queen d2, black went king h8, bringing that king to the side. And now I decide to go king h1, doing the same because I figured that the g file would be a source of counterplay. After king h1, black went rook g8. And with rook g8, he's kind of, flexing his muscles also on the g file, saying, hey, you're not the only one that can get some initiative going with g4. I might have something to say about it as well. After rook g8, I went rook g1 as well. Again, and we could see we're both trying to do battle on the g file right now. But it's pretty much white that has the luxury of this g4 idea at a nice juncture. h6 now is played, covering this this g5 square in some lines, and also giving the king a valuable escape story in h7, but it's actually a little bit slow. Instead, a move that geared up against g4 would have been a little bit more sensible, so h5 would have been good, queen g6 would have been good. h6 actually does not stop g4, and yeah, because of that, I actually should have gone for g4. I actually went g3 because I wasn't so sure g4 was the move I should play. But actually, after g4, if there's a series of exchanges, it's actually white that turns out to be better because I can double rooks on the g-file. This e4 pawn might be a target. Sometimes there's f5 ideas or bishop d4 ideas. And it actually be white that have the advantage here. So I actually should have gone for this g4 break. And this will actually be a theme in the next few moves because I actually play a few moves in succession where g4 should have been the move. So g3, this was the first opportunity I should have played g4 and didn't do it. Black now went c6, undermining my d5 pawn. And again, this makes a lot of sense. Note, again, he rallied his forces on the g file, put the king on h8, the rook on g8. Makes sense to undermine the center because it's a way you can get counterplay on the c file. So that makes a lot of sense. But even here, actually, g4 is the move I should have played. And I can kind of rip open the position, get promising play on the g file, and that's kind of where my counterplay is coming from. Instead, I played rook a d1, and it's just a mistake. It just kind of underestimates the dynamics in this position that kind of work out in my favor, and it's quite unfortunate because it's just a step in the wrong direction. Note, by the way, that if I played d takes c6, bishop takes c6, and queen takes d6, I thought this would be a huge mistake because it actually allows knight d3. And the problem is I can't take on d3 because of these discovery checks, which are actually a huge, huge problem for me. So I thought that putting my queen on d6 was not a good idea, and I got my hand in the cookie jar. So instead, I just decided to kind of, consolidate here best I could. But now D takes D6 was played, C takes D5 was played, and after knight takes D5, knight D5, and C D5, Black now actually was able to sort of pry open the C file and get some counterplay on this flank. And by doing that, he actually activates his rook in some lines. So the rook that was not really doing anything, a note that his rooks never really got connected here, now they actually have a purpose. Black now went queen f7, actually connecting those rooks finally, on d5, maybe thinking about rook c8 in some lines. And here, again, I should have played g4. Now, g4 is not as potent as it was in other lines, but after the series of exchanges, White still has decent chances to seize the initiative with rook g1 and bishop d4 or something along those lines, so it should have been considered. Instead, I actually went h3, and this is just simply too slow. Now, my idea is to play g4 and then recapture with the h-pawn, because that seems more desirable to me. But the problem is that when my pawn gets to g4, he doesn't actually have to take it. And so this move h3 just is kind of a slow move that gives Black counterplay on the queen side. Black now actually went knight a4 and took the liberty of getting that counterplay going. And now I have a little bit of a problem because b2 is loose. And the natural move b3 is actually quite poor because it actually allows knight c3, forking the bishop on e2 and the rook on d1. And losing the bishop pair in this type of position I thought would not be a good idea. So I basically had two choices. One of them was to play rook b1, and the other one was to kind of go forward with g4 finally. I thought that rook b1 was actually just a little bit too passive. I thought that Black would play rook a c8, and I just didn't like the idea of my rook being on b1 kind of not doing anything. So I actually decided to jettison the pawn with g4 and go for it finally. But it's funny, you could see that this move g4 was at least 3 or 4 moves too late from like its maximum effectiveness. Liran was actually down on time here, so I was hoping that I would be able to kind of drum up some counterplay in his time trouble, and I think that's also why I sacked a pawn, because I thought that that would give me some chances in his time trouble to win the game. But he kind of held firm and actually decided to play knight takes b2 and take up the gauntlet. And I thought this was extremely risky, but it's actually a good move because, again, my rook is now challenged and I have to move it. I went rook b1, and now the knight is nearly trapped, but he can go back to a4. And c3 is actually a problem again, this fork. And now he's a pawn up. So I thought I pretty much am obliged to take on b7 like I did. But now the move knight c3 came anyway because he's also hitting the pawn on d5 as well as the bishop on e2. And I thought that Black was actually probably doing fine here because he's simply too active right now, and I haven't managed to get at his king yet. So I didn't love my chances here, but I tried one last-ditch effort. I decided to play g5. I thought this was a way to kind of confuse him a little bit because g takes h6 is an idea, pawn g6 might be an idea, and I thought this tension and time trouble would be difficult to react to. But he actually reacted extremely well and went for the move queen takes d5. And this move, frankly, I kind of missed. The point is actually I can't just take the bishop on d7 because after queen takes d2, bishop takes d2, knight takes d2, knight takes e2, he actually recovers his piece. So the bishop is not hanging on d7 because the bishop on e2 is actually hanging. And then the other issue is that if I take on d5, then the bishop on e3 is hanging after knight takes d5. So pretty much however you slice it, Black just won a valuable central pawn, and I'm not winning a piece. So it's actually Black that's now a little bit better here. And this was kind of a cold shower to me because I thought I'd actually be able to press. So it went from a position where I thought I might be trying to play for something to a position where I was trying to hold the game, and I had to be very alert now to do that. I played queen takes d5 But that's actually not the most precise move. It actually would have been better to go rook takes d7 and force the queen trade this way, because on e2, I can actually go rook g2 here, and the knight on e2 is actually not super well placed, and it's a little bit vulnerable. And I also have g takes h6 and rook takes d6 as ideas. So it turns out here that that white would be able to hold this one a little bit easier than the way I did. But I must say, this is a position that it would seem black would just be better optically, just because we both have the same color bishop, and black's just up a pawn with a stronger center. So it is kind of hard to see that this is holding for white for a human. Instead, I decide to, play queen takes d5 and go for a position where at least there's opposite colored bishops, because I thought the presence of opposite colored bishops would give me more chances to hold. So after queen takes d5, knight takes d5, and g takes h6, very important intermediate move, threatening h takes g7 check. After bishop f6, now I went rook takes g8, rook takes g8, and rook takes d7. And my thought process here was that with the presence of opposite-colored bishops, I'd have better chances to hold, even though my pawn structure is fairly regrettable. Black now went knight takes e3, and I went rook takes d6. And here, I am actually up a pawn, but it's a really ugly pawn. And quite frankly, the most valuable pawn in the position is probably the e4 pawn right now. So I thought that black was actually the one playing for something here. And black actually went bishop h4, challenging my knight on f2, which appears to be nearly trapped. Fortunately, there is one square, d1, and that proves to be sufficient, because now after knight d1, I'm actually able to trade these knights and liquidate. Knight takes d1 was played, bishop takes d1, and of course I can't entertain winning chances here, but I did think the limited material and the presence of opposite-colored bishops would probably make it a draw. And that was my goal, just to have it peter out. Black went bishop g3, trying to challenge the f4 pawn and, get connected past pawns. And if he manages to do that, I'd be in trouble. But I played bishop b3 now, challenging this rook on g8. And here, black actually played bishop takes f4, which allows me to liquidate with bishop takes g8. The point is that after bishop takes d6, even though black has two connected passed pawns, I can actually force them to dark squares like this and then blockade on the light squares. And then the issue is after king h7, h4, king takes h6, and king g2, I just bring my king to e2, and there's basically no way that black can improve. Even if my h-pawn was not on the board, there's simply no way that black can break through this fortress. So we played a few moves. I actually didn't give him the h-pawn just because I didn't feel like it. And then we shuffled king e2, king d3. And now I actually went bishop g4, because if I go king e2, maybe his king walks in. So the point is now my king actually boxes him out and prevents him from actually getting in to attack the a-pawn. So I could just shuffle g4 and f3. And then if the king comes back around, then I'll shuffle king e2 and king d3. So the point is I have these squares on f3 and g4 for my bishop, and these squares to shuffle for my king. And because of that, the position is completely drawn. And after king f5, Liran actually offered me a draw, which I promptly accepted. Not a good game for me. I essentially drew a game against someone, that I'm definitely outrate, and I didn't really put enough pressure on him with white. And actually got into a position that was very, very shaky, but was able to simplify and hold the game, which, is important. It's important I didn't lose this one. But I missed this important g4 lever like 4 moves in a row. And, I just simply did not understand the position and what was urgent and what wasn't. And, it almost proved fatal. So I definitely needed to step my game up, because it was still no good games for me yet in this event. That being said, a draw is better than a loss, and I still hadn't lost a game yet through 5 rounds. So I was hoping, I might turn some things around. So Anyways, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.